Hi everyone, this is the lecture to accompany Chapter 4 in your textbook. Please watch this video before you complete the Chapter 4 Learn Smart assignment. We're going to be looking at the process of perception, some of the fundamental forces that influence our interpersonal perception, the attributions and biases that affect the way we perceive behavior, and ways to improve our interpersonal perception. So what is perception? It's the process of making meaning out of the stimuli that comes into our brains via our senses, what we see, hear, smell, taste, and touch. Interpersonal perception is the process of making meaning from the people in our environment and our relationships with them. It's about how we receive and interpret those interactions. The process of perception consists of 3 stages. Now, these stages happen so quickly that they're almost simultaneous, and we generally don't think about or even notice them, we just react to them. These stages are selection, which is what we choose to pay attention to, organization, the way we classify the stimulus, and interpretation, which is the meaning we assign to it. Let's look at all of them. First, selection. Things are happening around us all the time, and we can't pay attention to everything that's going on or we'd go insane. So we decide, either consciously or unconsciously, what to pay attention to. There are a few factors that help us to decide what to select, how unusual or unexpected the stimulus is, like a poorly dressed, obviously homeless old man walking on a college campus among all the much better dressed and younger students. You notice him because he seems out of place. Then the frequency of your exposure to a stimulus. You're going to notice more about a person you know well than one you don't know or just met. And then the intensity of the stimulus. You pay attention to a loud noise that occurs or a really good or really bad smell. One of the things that's not mentioned here is if you are directed to pay attention to something, like when you followed the directions for the YouTube selective attention test and paid attention to how many times the ball was passed among the participants. Did you even see the gorilla? Some people do, but many people don't because they're paying such close attention to where the ball's going. Don't feel bad if you didn't see it. Sometimes people actually notice the gorilla but don't really think much about it because that's not what they were asked to focus on. Anyway, as you can see, we only have so much space in our brain to pay attention to something, and these are usually the factors that determine where our attention goes. The next stage in the process is organization. This is where you attempt to make sense of the stimulus by classifying it, putting it into recognizable categories. What is it similar to? Where does it fit in with what you already know about? Your mind applies a perceptual schema to it, which is a mental framework for organizing information. We use 4 types of schema to classify information we notice about other people: physical constructs, role constructs, interaction constructs, and psychological constructs. Physical constructs have to do with their appearance. What do they look like? What are their physical characteristics? Role constructs are where they fit into the social or professional world, like what can you tell about what their job or their status is. Interaction constructs have to do with their behavior, how are they acting, and psychological constructs have to do with our perceptions about their possible thoughts and feelings, like do they seem upset or happy? These perceptual schemas help us to organize information about that person so that we can move on to the final step, interpretation. This is the step where you figure out what all this information you've gathered about this person actually means. There are some things that help us with this interpretation step. How much past experience have you had with this person? Have they behaved in this particular way before? How much knowledge do you have about them? Do you know that they possess a particular characteristic or quality? And how close is your relationship with them? All these things factor in to help you make a decision about what the interaction really means. We've been making perceptions and coming to conclusions based on those perceptions for our entire lives. So you'd think we'd be pretty accurate in those conclusions by now. And maybe you think you are pretty accurate, but, well, you're probably not as accurate as you think you are. There are several things that get in the way and affect the accuracy of our perceptions. Physiological states and traits, cultures and co-cultures, and social roles. Physiology has to do with our mechanical and biochemical body systems. Physiological states are temporary conditions that affect us. One state that we might experience is tiredness, another one is hunger, and still another one is feeling ill. So when we experience those states, it can affect our ability to accurately gauge what's going on with ourselves and others around us. When my daughter is particularly unreasonable, I usually ask her, "Have you eaten anything?" And she usually says no. Hunger really puts a damper on her perceptive ability. Physiological traits, on the other hand, are things that affect us on an ongoing basis. Our senses, our ability to see, hear, etc., these can affect our perception. So if you need glasses but you're not wearing them, you're going to perceive something very differently than if you have them on. Because our sensory abilities tend to differ from person to person, our perceptual abilities also differ. Another thing that affects our perception is the culture and co-cultures with which we identify. Because there are lots of differences between cultures, what one culture deems perfectly appropriate may be interpreted as inappropriate from the perspective of another culture. Our co-cultures also play a role in our perceptions of others. For example, people in different political parties often perceive each other in very negative ways. Different social classes may do the same. The lenses by which individuals view others are often colored by their own cultures and co-cultures. And social roles are also a factor. These are the expectations society has of the behavior of different people in certain situations, and that can affect our perception. Gender roles, for instance. If someone expects a woman to act in a particular way in a particular situation, and then she acts in a totally different way, that person might perceive her negatively, even if what she's doing is perfectly acceptable. Most of us really believe that the way we see the world is the way it really is. But there are lots of forces out there that make us vulnerable to a large number of biases, and those affect our perception. One of the strongest ones is stereotyping. Remember back in Chapter 2, I talked about the differences between what social scientists need to do when they're making observations and drawing general conclusions about groups of people, and stereotyping, which is using generalizations that are often based on misunderstandings and prejudice, and using that to make a decision about an individual. Our perception of someone often includes categorizing them as a member of a particular group, like ethnicity, race, and gender, and then we recall a generalization that others make about people in that group, and we apply that generalization to that person. We might not do it consciously. In fact, we often aren't aware when we stereotype someone, which makes it very insidious. And it's difficult to overcome because part of the process of perception involves organizing people into categories. We need to remember that people are all individuals, and stereotyping underestimates the differences among individuals in a particular group. But now you're more aware, and you can make a commitment to check your perceptions before you act on them. There are lots of other forces that influence our perceptions. There's the primacy effect, which has to do with first impressions. These can be very powerful and lasting and set the tone for all your future interactions with someone. If your first impression of someone is negative, it might be very hard to overcome that and see them in a more positive light. But those impressions can be changed. One of my dearest friends really made a negative impression on me when I first met him. It took a while, but I finally began to see that he was really a good person, despite my first impression. Another influence is the recency effect, which has to do with our most recent impression of someone. You can change your perception of someone from positive to negative, or vice versa, based on your most recent interactions with them. Let's say you're interviewing a candidate for a job and they might immediately impress you with their knowledge and manners. So you call them back in for a second interview, but during that conversation they say something that you perceive to be prejudicial against an ethnic group with several members who work at your company. This most recent interaction convinces you that this is not the right person for the job. We all have something known as a perceptual set that limits what we perceive. It's a predisposition to perceive only what we want to or expect to perceive, based on all our biases, expectations, and desires. In other words, we often see what we want to see and disregard the rest. Some people see the face of Jesus in a piece of toast because that's what they want to see when they look at it. Some people perceive that any affection shown between two men means that those people are homosexuals because that's the behavior they would expect homosexuals to have. Egocentrism is another thing that gets in the way of perception. Egocentrism is the inability to look at things from another person's perspective. We are often under the mistaken impression that other people see the world the same way we do. Then we can't understand why they have a different opinion. We think there must be something wrong with them because we know the way things are. Then there's the positivity and negativity biases. The positivity bias causes us to have an overly idealistic view of someone, to the point that we overlook or downplay information about them that might not be so good. We often perceive a new romantic partner this way, but in a healthy relationship we begin to see and understand that this person is not perfect, even if they are perfect for us. The negativity bias is the opposite. We only see the negative aspects of a person. Sadly, negative information often outweighs positive information in our brain, and it might cause us not to give someone a chance, even if it's in our best interest to do so. Humans are driven to make sense of the world. We need to understand not just what happened, but why it happened. When we're figuring out why we and other people do things, we formulate attributions. These are the explanations we give for our own and other people's behavior. We make these attributions based on their locus, stability, and controllability. Well, what does that mean? The locus of a behavior is where we believe the behavior is located. Does it come from inside that person or outside? What I mean is, did this behavior spring from a characteristic or quality that this person has? That's an internal locus. Or is it a response to an event that happened outside of that person? That's an external locus. Let me give you an example. Your employee is late for work and hasn't called in, so you don't really have any information about why they aren't there. Could the behavior be due to an internal locus, such as he's lazy and doesn't want to come to work, or he's overslept because he was out drinking last night? Or could it be due to an external locus, like heavy traffic on the freeway, he got a flat tire on the way to work, or his wife called to say that their son got sick at school and he has to go get him, and his cell phone battery died so he couldn't call in? Those are all potential explanations. Another dimension of attribution is stability. This has to do with whether the explanation we give about the cause of the behavior is something that happens always, sometimes, rarely, or has never happened before. Is this person always late or pretty much always on time? Heavy traffic is something that happens a lot. An accident on the way to work, not so much. Finally, controllability. How much of this behavior is under this person's control? How much of it is out of their control? If they got drunk last night and overslept, that's obviously under their control. But if they're stuck on the freeway due to an accident up ahead, that's not under their control. The attributions we give to ourselves and others' behavior is very prone to the following biases: self-serving bias, fundamental attribution error, and over-attribution. We are guilty of the self-serving bias when we attribute our positive behavior to internal stable causes, but our negative behavior to outside unstable causes over which we have no control. The book gives a good example of this. If you get an A on the test, you tell yourself it's because you're smart. But if you flunk a test, you say it's because the test was unfair, or you didn't have time to study because your boss called you into work. The term self-serving refers to the idea that your successes are deserved, but your failures are not your fault. But really, some of your successes are due to outside forces, and some of your failures are due to your own shortcomings. It's just really hard to face up to that, so we delude ourselves. The fundamental attribution error occurs because we tend to attribute the behavior of others to internal rather than external causes. When you see another driver swerving on the road ahead, what do you automatically think? Probably that they're drunk or texting or something equally irresponsible and dangerous. And of course, then you think something's wrong with their character or their life choices, and you call them a jerk. Now, while that attribution might actually be true, it also might be true that a wasp flew into their car and stung them, and they're trying to maintain control while they find a place to pull over, but they're in pain and panicked. But we rarely consider that other external factors might be to blame. This error is so strong that even when we find out that the cause of someone's behavior was not their fault, we still think that the fault is somehow theirs, or they could have done something to prevent it. You might say something like, well, why was he driving with the windows down? As if driving with the windows down was somehow a bad thing. People do not always make mistakes due to some character flaw, and you don't always make mistakes due to some uncontrollable outside event. But our brains fool us into thinking this. Something for you to recognize and to work on overcoming. Finally, over-attribution. This is where we focus on one or two characteristics of a person and then attribute everything they do to those characteristics. When you say things like, well, she's an only child, so of course she did that, or he's a man or she's a woman, so what did you expect? You're guilty of over-attribution. Human beings are far more complex than that, and there could be numerous explanations for their behavior that have nothing to do with simple stereotypes. Okay, so we apparently suck at perception. Well, not really. But I hope you see how easy it is to make perceptual mistakes about people. There are things we can do to become more mindful and work towards a better understanding of others. You've already taken the first step, which is to learn about the biases inherent in each of us. Now you need to recognize them in yourself. It's always easier to see bias in others than it is to look inward, but you really need to. Then you need to recognize that things like gender and culture are often part of ours and others' characteristics, and they influence the perceptions we have of each other. And consider the context in which communication occurs. What's going on? How much of it do you really know? And how does that factor into an understanding of what's happening? And now that you know how the perception process occurs, you need to check your perceptions for accuracy. You might have come to a conclusion about someone's behavior, but how much of that is based on actual facts, and how much is based on your interpretations, what you think might have happened? Generate some alternate interpretations besides the one you automatically assume to be correct. Sometimes you do need to give people the benefit of the doubt, at least until you're sure of your interpretations. And be willing to adjust and revise those perceptions when new information comes to light. Understanding how we process interpersonal information and the many biases that can impact our ability to perceive things accurately can go a long way towards having better communication and better relationships with the people around us. Okay, you're ready to complete the Learn Smart Chapter 4 assignment.